Welcome to Compound Insights, a podcast by CFA Society New York. I'm your host, Rob Rowan. Today we're talking about a very insightful topic. I think this is exceptionally interesting because it rises above the political fray, which we're seeing a lot in the news. And that is what increasing defense spending by the EU states would do to their credit. We're speaking today with Federico Barriga-Salazar. He is a senior director and the head of Western European Sovereign Team at Fitch Ratings. Previously, he worked as a risk manager in an impact fund based in Zurich, and he was an analyst covering Latin America for the Economist Intelligence Unit. So welcome to the podcast, Federico.
Thank you, Rob.
So I was taken by your piece because it was surprisingly sober compared to the other things that I've read about this topic. So let me just cut right to the chase. How would an increase in defense spending of the magnitudes that we're talking about now, as we record this on March 21st, how would they impact the credit of the EU states?
So let me start from the fact that, yes, I think from where we are today, we have two ways of thinking about the fiscal impact from higher defense spending in Europe. One is around additional EU spending at the sort of general level. There's a 150 billion that's been announced already by von der Leyen, and I think it's probably a certainty that it's going to happen, which is meant to be kind of on lending to some of the member states that perhaps don't have this fiscal space to do it. Right. And this week, the EU published a paper around kind of how they think this Rearm EU is going to work. So they have some conditionalities about how this funding should be used, joint projects, defense spending should be done mostly on EU defense companies, etc. But the big part of the package, and that's how the EU framed it a couple of weeks ago with this 800 billion, I think, which they want in additional spending. And this is an important point. It's additional on top of what countries had already planned. So actually, it's quite a large number, right? Should be done through national financing. They want to encourage or allow member states to do this by what they call sort of calling on this national escape clause from the fiscal rules, which allows countries to say, okay, we're going to spend this additional amount of money on defense, and we're not going to get caught by the Commission saying, well, you can allow do this, or you're going to end up in the excessive deficit procedure. Yeah. The interesting part, of course, is, and I think that was what the piece was trying to show, is actually who can actually spend more, right? And what are the consequences around this? Because this is the important point for us, right? Mm-hmm. Having the ability to do it, first of all, doesn't mean that countries should or do it. And we've already seen, and clearly the one that makes the big difference is Germany, right? So over the last decades, many economists in Europe have talked about the rebalancing within the EU as to how Germany should spend more. And this debate became much more important in Germany over the last couple of years because of the slower growth, because of some of the structural issues. And now with the defense spending, this became the catalyst to say, yes, we have to do it now. So in a way, the country that needed to spend the most and which had probably the largest fiscal space is doing what it's supposed to do. So, and we've been kind of clear in a more recent piece on Germany that we think that, this additionality of spending would be conceivable with a AAA for now. It gets more interesting when we go through the other countries in the list, yes. Right? And I think one of the points that we've made over the last couple of years is that in the European fiscal space is very heterogeneous, right? So you have countries with a very high level of debt, with a weak fiscal position. Italy has come to mind. Mm-hmm. Greece to a lesser extent because they have a sort of more stable fiscal framework, but very high debt. Right. And those that were formerly in the middle but have been in the spotlight of the market, Belgium a few years ago for us, and France in particular, right? So France's debt level is not as high as Italy, but if you think about the medium-term debt projections for France, it's getting closer to 125, 130, with deficits of over 5% of GDP. So here we've been a bit more careful at saying, look, it's all well and good that countries like France and Italy would be allowed to spend additional money for defense, but it's most likely not going to happen to the same extent as Germany. And even if they do apply sort of this national escape clause, it's most likely that they would try to find some offsetting mechanisms, not to lead to much higher deficits over the medium term. And it's pretty clear because in Italy, they're really trying hard to bring down the deficits so that debt remains relatively stable. Right. And in France, they need to make quite a lot of significant consolidation commitments outside of defense to even try to stabilize the debt. So if you're adding another 1% of GDP in terms of defense, we see it as quite challenging. So our message, to sort of wrap it up here, is kind of quite nuanced, right? So yes, Germany is a case in point, geostrategically important that it spends, and the rating is relatively resilient. For the rest, we have to wait and see because there are some potential risks if additional spending and additional pressures on the public finances, could kind of trigger our rating sensitivities on the negative side.
Right. Now, if I remember correctly from my reading, Fitch's rating case is 3 years? I'm going to ask
2 years.
2 years. Okay. I was going to ask you a longer term question here.
Sure.
Growing a strong defense for a country or a coalition of countries like the EU is not just a 1-year fiscal impact. It takes years to do. I've seen some estimates that it'll take 10. So I wonder how you all handle that in terms of forecasting, leaving out whether the political will be there in 7 years. But how do you all handle this on a going forward basis?
So as we mentioned before, we sort of work on a 2-year horizon for most of our forecasts, but we have debt dynamics that go 5 to 10 years.
Right.
And that's the exercise that we're conducting now. Mm-hmm. Because clearly, as you said, and 2025, we're not going to see significant changes per se. This changes of additional expenditure is probably going to happen from 2026 onwards, right? And correctly, the target, well, first of all, the Commission's original target was for a 4-year horizon, so it's a little bit more short term. But the latest discussions are about 10 years. So Germany's recent vote is about a 10-year horizon, as you said. So this additional spending, which people have estimated between 500 to 700 billion, is over a 10-year horizon. And we look into this from two perspectives. So first, of course, the short to medium term impact that might affect the debt dynamics, but at some point we do have to analyze whether there's going to be additional fiscal pressures over the medium term, which leads to I think in most cases, what we're worried about is that debt just keeps going up.
Right.
Of course, we have also some ratings where there's been a positive rating trajectory driven by a reduction in public debt. So we also have to think, if public debt stops falling, is this going to mean that the rating trajectory on the positive side stops?
Right. And that's where it gets kind of tricky, because you all will look at not only the absolute amount of debt, you'll look at the fiscal deficit, and also the other consolidation factors that are happening. You take it all together.
Exactly. And, of course, none of this sort of exists in a bubble, right? I mean, the whole discussion on defense brings also the idea of what's the spillovers to growth. Right. So it could be potentially beneficial. And, of course, that would be beneficial for public debt, right? We have stronger growth. Also, the potential effect on inflation, although I think that is unlikely going to move the needle. But the offsetting side, of course, which is also interesting because it's a bit evident already, is on the increased yields, on the increasing interest rates. And of course, the interest rate component is very key for the longer term debt dynamics, right? Because if a country, say like Germany or any country in Europe that has seen in the last couple of weeks yields increase by about 30 basis points, it doesn't affect them for this year or next because their average maturity is about 7 to 8 years. But it starts feeding in over the medium term. Countries that in the recent years have been in the focus because of this debt sustainability, again, Italy is the prime case, right? If you have a major shift on the interest rate dynamics, even if they're not doing anything to the expenditure side,
right,
can have an effect on the public debt,
right,
and obviously on the rating.
Yeah, and even if they're just treading water with the debt, it still becomes an increase in expenses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is one of the risks that is quite clear in this, although I'm not sure recent experience is really that good because, boy, it's been weird in the bond market, right? Gold is $3,000 an ounce and the U.S. long bond is 4 or 5. So we're in a weird time. Things are going to calm down a little, I think. So It's a strange thing. Now, I wonder also how you all look at, because you point out that some of the countries have more spending flexibility than others. You mentioned France, which is an exceptionally integral part of the EU, but also has relatively less spending flexibility than Germany does. So, how do you all determine that in terms of the overall? How do you look at that overall?
So, I mean, we have an econometric model that takes in some of the quantitative aspects, and here, obviously, the level of public debt is important. The debt servicing is an important factor in, so interest revenue. So things that are very, let's say, quantitative in nature. And of course, in this respect, Germany's debt at 63% of GDP last year compared to France's 112% already gives you quite a large difference, a large delta. And okay, and Italy at 135. It's obvious, right? But we also look into some sort of qualitative factors. And here I think it's also important to look at maybe the track record that countries have had in terms of dealing with public debt. And this is a very important point we try to make. Why? Because Germany is not just about what the level of debt is now and what would it be in 5 years, but say, okay, we understand, or we follow the logic that there's needs to be additional spending at this point in the cycle, right? In the political and in the geopolitical and economic cycle. When there are good times, then you would expect public finances to improve. And actually, this is something that we have seen in Germany in the past, right? So Germany has a long track record of being prudent at managing their fiscal stance. Now, maybe too prudent, according to some economists, whereas France does not have this, right? So the last time, for example, France ran a primary surplus is over a few decades ago. The last time they ran a primary balance surplus was over 5 decades ago, I think. So it's a really long time. And every time countries face an additional shock, and Europe has been facing a few shocks in the last couple of years, public debt levels in some countries just keep going up without seeing sort of the turnaround. So this, for example, it's a very important sort of qualitative assessment as well. We try to also take into account not only on the rating levels, but also on how we look at the rating outlooks and what direction of travel will be for these credits.
Right. So that is actually, I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the things in your piece that came clear to me. And this is part of the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast, so you would say that. This is something that I think is being left out of a lot of discussions about this, even when you're not just, I realize the rating agencies are just saying it, but I'm talking about the rest of the bond market is not really talking about that exceptionally important detail of the long run. And everyone's kind of like preoccupied with the short run. I mean, you all had some good charts in this piece that I keep talking about. In case anyone's looking for it, it's a public piece on Fitch's website called "Higher Defense Spending Will Add to Pressure on Europe's Public Finances." It was published on February 25th. I recommend everybody take a look at it because it's got some good charts that explain a little bit about what Federico was just saying. So now going forward, I wonder also how you all look at the how do you model, and do you model the political stability of this view? It took a lot of political work to get this process started. Even The Economist last week had what I thought was actually a pretty good piece by Hollande from France, who was but everybody was banging on this for a while, and the EU moved for the EU at lightning speed. But that doesn't mean that political wherewithal will always be there, particularly if this comes at other sacrifices. So how do you all put that into your forecast?
I think this is one of the hardest things to do. I mean, history probably over the last couple of decades, at least since the early 2000s, showed that Europe moves much quicker when there's a crisis.
Yeah.
So in the years where nothing happens, then they talk and not much happens, right? We've seen this in the pandemic, in the energy crisis, and now. Clearly now it's a very important moment for Europe to try to change the relation around defense. I think it's pretty clear, and I think it's going to remain the case even if there's changes in the political scenario elsewhere in the world. I think Europeans have come to that point. As you said, right, I mean, there's been a lot of voices around this direction for a while, and some even for decades, but why now? I mean, of course, why now? It has also to do with the change in Germany, right? I think without Germany, the whole European project of defense would have never worked. And we were expecting that there's going to be, of course, the change of government. Then Friedrich Merz from the CDU was going to take over, and that they were going to consider some changes to the constitutional rule. But we weren't really expecting this kind of response. So there's really, I think, and the markets reacted, everyone like this, right? No one was expecting this kind of political commitment. So I have to say, in a way, this decisiveness and the fact that they've managed to pass it through. So today was the last, let's say, hurdle of passing that. It's kind of a good omen that they're really going to push for this geopolitical change. But unfortunately, this kind of events is very difficult to predict from a quantitative point of view. Right. So we look at the ratings are fed through some governance indicators, but they tend to be very slow moving. So in this case, we tend to just react to events. Of course, we create some baselines, and now we're also sort of thinking about the whole of the continent. And now that we have kind of the idea of how this should work, how realistic it is for certain member states to also increase defense or not. And this also has to do with how we view the political scenario domestically, right? So we're trying to make some qualitative adjustments in this respect. But generally speaking, for something so large like what happened now in Germany, we were also taken a little bit by surprise.
Yeah, that was what happened when France tried to raise the retirement date. That was not surprising. But the attempt to pass all of those changes before the end of the term in Germany was.
Yeah, exactly. So because I'm based in Germany, there were some discussions previously about whether it would be possible to do it, but everyone seemed to be very dismissive about the outcome. So even if you asked the experts 3-4 weeks before the vote if the parliament would be able to approve anything, everyone would have said unlikely, and certainly not to the extent that we're talking about, right? I mean, we're talking about a fiscal package that is worth almost more than 20% of the country's GDP, and
right.
It's very, very significant.
Right. Well, there were a couple other factors that started this, right? So there's been some move to the right and more sort of domestic, pride, so to speak, in the around the developed world. There was the invasion of Ukraine, which also pushed this agenda a little bit. Some of the changes in the votes, like there was a sort of drib drab of things that came along. It wasn't just Germany, right? There were a lot of things that came along that way, but does make it exceptionally difficult to look at from an analytical perspective. But perhaps we should leave it there because it is exceptionally challenging, and there's more to come. I encourage everyone who's listening to podcasts to take a look at Federico's writing. It was excellent. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
And thanks to everyone for listening to this podcast. If you are interested in hearing more about this, CFA Society New York is rolling out a revamped version of our global investing group. And if you're interested in these topics and you're a member, you can join it today by going to our website. Until next time, I'm Rob Rowan, and this has been Compound Insights.